Hello friends, my name is AJ and I am a rising high school senior. From a very young age, I've been very interested in programming, and since then I've taught myself many different things about different programming languages and technologies. In this video, I wanted to share some of the things I learned as well as what I believe are the top 5 best programming languages you can learn as a student. This video will be geared mainly toward both beginners and also people with just a little bit of experience. Beginners can learn kind of what are the best languages maybe to start out with, and then people who are more seasoned in programming may be able to watch the video and then figure out some of other languages that they can also add to their knowledge. Alright, so without further ado, let's get started. Alright everyone, I'm going to go over my list as well as a few honorable mentions, but for each programming language, I'm going to talk about some pros as to good things about the language and also some negatives about the language so that you can kind of understand a little bit more about each of the options. Alright, so let's get started with number 5. Alright, number 5 on the list are C-based programming languages. This includes C, C++, but mainly C#. And this is a very good, especially C# is the one that I'm mainly talking about in this particular portion. C# is a great programming language to learn, and it does offer all of the fundamental aspects of programming. So when you learn the language, you will generally learn a majority of the things that you will need to kind of know for the future with programming. And C# is also widely used in things like games and Windows applications. So for those people who are very interested in either working on programming or learning how to program so that they can learn games or maybe learn how to build desktop applications in Windows, then C# may be a great language to learn. Now, the main two negatives with this, and the reason why it is so low on the list, is number one, it is probably the most complicated language out of all of the options that are on this list. It is generally a lot more difficult to learn as a beginner, and beginners may get very frustrated and very confused very quickly. Which is why I recommend for this language that you may want to wait and maybe learn some of the ones that are higher on the list and then always come back to this language once you've learned a little bit of the basics, and then that'll just make learning the language a little bit easier. In addition, this particular language, because it is mainly used for things such as Windows apps, you mainly use C# in a program called Visual Studio. And Visual Studio is mainly a Windows application. So if you're using something such as a Mac or anything that is not Windows, learning C# and actually applying C# to make applications may be just a little bit more difficult. Alright everyone, that wraps up the 5th item on the list, and now I'm going to move to one of my personal favorite programming languages. For number 4, we are talking about the Swift programming language. Swift is extremely easy to learn, very powerful, and is used to create iOS applications, macOS applications, tvOS applications, pretty much anything related to Apple products. And Swift is generally one of the languages that is very easy to learn. It's also very powerful, and there are a lot of resources around the language. Also, the language is very fast growing, and there are multiple updates that keep coming out, making the language even more powerful and interesting to learn. Also, the language has a lot of beginner resources created by both Apple and other third parties, which makes it very easy to quickly get into, especially if you are interested in trying to make iOS applications or pretty much anything related to the Apple ecosystem. Now, this language would be far higher on the list, except for one of the main drawbacks with this language, in my mind, which brings it down a lot, is the cost of entry. And basically what this means is that in order to actually work with the Swift programming language, it actually costs a lot more to get started than with another language. What do I mean by that? Well, the actual Swift programming language, the main IDE or program you use to code Swift is Xcode. And Xcode is an exclusively Mac OS application. So the problem is that in order to really do anything with Swift to an extent of actually like making a application on the computer or making an iOS application, you're going to need to have a Mac computer in order to actually do these things. And there are also some workarounds, but most of those workarounds are A, not official, and B, not that cost effective either. And you're always going to eventually have to go and fall back onto a Mac version in order to, for example, compile a final product. And what I really mean in terms of the cost is that, of course, Mac computers are a lot more expensive than Windows counterparts. For example, you can get a decent Windows computer for probably $500, $600, but the beginning Mac, the cheapest Mac available on their particular website as of this recording, was $800. And for $800, you're not going to get a computer that's probably going to be fast enough or with enough storage to be able to store the applications such as Xcode. You're going to need to have a little bit more power and a little bit more space than the extremely basic option that they offer. So given all of that, actually being able to use Swift and use kind of Xcode along with Swift was going to require a Mac computer. And also iOS devices if you want to actually test your things in real life. So if you do not have access to this, let's say that you are a mainly Android user and a Windows user, then this is probably not going to be a good option for you. Now, if you do happen to own a Mac computer and you do have different iOS devices that you're lying around, that's what you mainly use, then Swift is a great language to get started with learning, and I definitely recommend it. Alright everyone, that brings me to number 3 on the list, which is a very popular and very versatile language known as JavaScript. And many people may have heard of JavaScript before, either as they're doing some research or they're kind of beginning to really think about programming in general. You probably heard that word JavaScript. And JavaScript is one of the languages which has so many uses. JavaScript is both used in the back end of websites. So for example, whenever you're interacting with a website, whenever you click a button, whenever you maybe slide on a slider, anytime you're interacting with that website, JavaScript is pretty much what is behind all of that. In addition to that, JavaScript can even be used toward building applications for both Android and iOS using a third-party kind of package known as React Native. But generally, the language is mostly used for web, but there are, again, so many uses that you can do. People make games with it, people make web apps with it, and again, people even make iOS and mobile applications, both iOS and Android, using JavaScript. It is an extremely versatile language to learn, and if you choose to learn it, then you are going to be able to try out so many things with language, and you will never run out of ideas in terms of whenever you're working on your own projects or you want to learn something new. There is always also going to be resources to turn to. Because JavaScript is so versatile and is so widely used, so many people have made really good JavaScript resources. So if you're trying to learn and you got stuck on something and you look up something on the internet, you will probably never find yourself in a solution where you will not have an answer. There has bound to be, just based on how many people use JavaScript and how many resources are available, you will pretty much always have an answer to your question directly right there on the internet for any sort of question that you may have, especially while learning JavaScript. Now, the only downside to JavaScript is mainly that JavaScript is just slightly more confusing compared to some of the other languages, especially if you're learning as kind of in a beginning. JavaScript is not that hard, especially compared to things like the C language, which is number 5, or C#, but it is slightly maybe more difficult than a language like Swift. Just kind of getting your brain around certain things, as well as learning some more advanced features. You may find yourself having to spend a little bit more time understanding what you're doing and then being able to apply it, rather than kind of it's less intuitive in that sense. Despite that, JavaScript is definitely a great language. So if you're interested in things like web or making websites, maybe making some games, or even interested in how some websites work, and maybe also just want to put your foot into a little bit of mobile development, JavaScript is going to be a great language for you to learn. Alright everyone, now we're going to be going to number 2, which is Java. You've probably heard of Java at this point, either from the internet or maybe from doing a little bit of research. Java is a great language in general and is one of the most popular object-oriented programming languages. Now, you may have heard of that term either by doing some research or maybe you have just heard of it, and if you haven't, that's perfectly okay. Object-oriented programming languages are kind of just slightly different than some other programming languages in the way you structure your code. That is kind of the most simplest way that I can explain it without, with trying to make it a little bit more of a beginner level, especially for some of you who may not have any experience in programming. Maybe the people who have a little bit more experience may know what I'm talking about when I say object-oriented languages. But Java is an object-oriented programming language. So if you're learning Java, then you're going to learn a very important skill which can be used and applied toward many other different types of many different other programming languages, such as Swift and other languages which do also have a similar object-oriented main backbone. Another thing is that Java is a workhorse language. There are so many things you can do with Java, and it powers so many things. Java can be both used for desktop applications, which is a very popular usage. It can be used toward any sort of just program in general, games, and another one is Android development. You can actually do Android development with Java. And Java was actually the first language, or not necessarily the first, but it was the main language for a very long time for building Android apps. And it is definitely, if you're interested in that kind of stuff and you have Android devices, Java is a great language to learn. In addition, Java, there are a lot of resources on the internet for Java, just simply because the language has been around for a while and so many people have used it for different purposes, just like with JavaScript, which, by the way, they both have very similar names, but they are quite different languages. So just because, JavaScript and Java does not necessarily mean that they are related in any way, that or in any very intensive way. Now, Java, as I was saying, has many resources that you can use to learn. So if you get stuck, you will pretty much always find a resource to be able to maybe help your understanding. And there are some great resources on the internet. Another thing with Java is that Java is actually taught in a majority of colleges. If you look at a lot of college courses, Java is a language that is pretty much taught in most computer science type of classes in general, mainly because, again, of that object-oriented component and just the fact that Java has so many uses. In fact, Java is also taught in some high schools with the class called AP Computer Science, which is a college board class. If you're a high school student, you probably have heard of AP classes and you know about the college board and you know about that kind of stuff. But AP Computer Science, that particular class, AP Computer Science A specifically, because there's also AP Computer Science Principles, which is not related to Java in any way, but AP Computer Science A, that particular course does teach Java. So if you are interested, or even if you are going kind of through high school, then maybe learning a little bit of Java may even help you for that class. And if you are interested in learning a little bit about Java or even getting prepared for AP Computer Science A, I do have a playlist of a bunch of different reviews for that particular class. So even if you're interested maybe in learning a little bit of Java, then you could definitely check out those videos where I kind of go in depth of the different units for AP Computer Science A, where I talk about kind of the different things that you will need to know as you progress in learning Java. So Java is a great language to learn. Now, in terms of kind of the two more negative aspects, one is that it's slightly more complicated to understand compared to some other languages such as Python, especially at the beginning. Once you kind of learn a little bit more, then it will become a little bit easier, but definitely it is just slightly more complicated to learn, and it's not as intuitive as it could be. Now, another thing with Java is that, and this kind of goes with that factor of more complexity and difficulty, is that some lines of code in Java, for example, compared to other languages, you have to just type more in order to do the exact same thing. For example, in one language, what may only take you, 3 words to actually do, in Java it may take you 5 or 6 words. So that in itself kind of is indicating of a little bit more of complexity with the language. But definitely Java is a great language to learn, and there are so many resources, so I definitely recommend trying out Java. Alright, but before I go to the number one best language, in my opinion, to learn as a student or beginner in 2020, I want to go over 2 honorable mentions. The first honorable mention I want to go over is the Kotlin programming language. And Kotlin is very similar to Swift in the way that it's kind of a counterpart to Swift, but for Android instead of for iOS. Now, that does not mean that the languages are similar in terms of how you write them, but the simplicity is definitely something that they both have in common. Kotlin is a lot easier to understand than Java. For a long time, Java was the main programming language that you used in order to write Android apps. However, Kotlin has kind of made making Android apps a lot more simpler and easy to learn. Especially if you're interested in Android development, and Android development mainly only, then definitely Kotlin is a great language. But one of the main reasons why I did not include it in the top 5 list is simply 2 reasons. First, Kotlin is relatively new, and there are not as many resources on Kotlin, especially when you're trying to learn as a complete beginner. Another thing is that if you're working with Kotlin to build Android apps and you are stuck on a certain part, if you look up how to actually do something on the internet majority of the time for Kotlin, you may not even find many resources. And the resources you do find is in Java and not in Kotlin. So that can be very frustrating, especially for people who are kind of just starting out and they want to learn about programming and they want to learn the language, then that can definitely hinder a lot of people and make them very discouraged. Another thing is that Kotlin can't really be used for that much except for Android. Well, it can, but Android is its main primary purpose. It's not where, if you want to do with, for example, another language such as JavaScript or even Java, if you want to try out many different things, such as like with JavaScript's example, like web development or maybe app development or all those different things, then in general, you can't necessarily do that with Kotlin. Kotlin pretty much restricts you down to making Android apps. And that was actually the main reason why I also did not include it on the list, is simply that it's not as versatile, it's not as, it doesn't allow you to do as many things as other languages. And as a beginner, you're really interested in programming and you want to learn, then you want to pretty much have a language that you can learn many different things and kind of try out many different things. You don't want to just start out with the language and then realize that you can only really do one thing with it and then have to go and learn something else. That is simply not as good of a use of time. So definitely Kotlin is a really good language for Android development, but I generally recommend to maybe wait on Kotlin until you learn some other languages first. Alright, and the second language I want to include on my honorable mentions list, and this one's not necessarily a programming language per se, is HTML and CSS. Now, HTML is the basis of all websites on the internet. It provides the structure of websites. All of the text you see, the general layout, all of that is managed within HTML. Now, CSS kind of goes with HTML because CSS allows you to basically style website. It adds color to websites. It maybe works on kind of the layout. It works on mainly what you see, the visual component of the website. HTML is more of the structure of the website. Now, regardless of whether or not you want to learn programming or not, learning a little bit about HTML is going to be fundamental, regardless of whatever you learn, mainly because no matter anything, if you want to do anything regarding websites in general, HTML is a necessity in the sense that if you're working on maybe making your own website through some other language, whether you're learning JavaScript and want to connect your JavaScript to a website, HTML is going to be one of the most fundamental things that you are going to have to at least learn at some point. And you don't have to learn it that in depth, just a little bit to get a good understanding. And the thing is also with HTML is there are just so many resources on the internet. Because it is the basis of almost all web pages, there are just so many really good resources. You will almost never run out of new things to try and also different things to learn, and you will almost never run out of answers to so many questions simply because, again, HTML is so prevalent. Now, the main reason why this wasn't on the list is that this is not necessarily a programming language. HTML is a markup language, but not a programming language. What does that mean? Well, if I'm specifying the structure of a website, HTML is great. It structures the physical website and the different components of the website. But then, once you get to the point of actually interacting with the website, for example, clicking a button, again, using like a slider, all of those things, that is not what HTML and CSS are built for. In fact, JavaScript is that particular component. What a programming language allows you to do is it allows you to kind of do certain actions. That's the main purpose of a programming language. It actually does something physically, and it actually performs certain actions. And the thing is that HTML and CSS are mainly going to be for structuring and styling a website, but it doesn't actually provide any usability, functionality to the website. And that is mainly the job of a programming language such as JavaScript, which is mainly tied together to make websites work and function properly. And that is kind of the main reason, is that because it's not a programming language, you're not going to learn any of the very, very important skills you're going to need to learn for any other programming language, such as making decisions, completing actions. All of those things are not going to be a part of HTML and CSS. And that is the reason why it wasn't on the list. However, I did want to include it because, again, it's such a very important component that even though it's not necessarily a programming language, and if you're getting started with programming, you may not necessarily want to learn HTML and CSS first, it's definitely something that you want to maybe look at just a little bit at some points, that you have a very good understanding of how websites are structured. And maybe then when you, for example, if you learn something like JavaScript and want to make your own website, then HTML and CSS will help you do that. All right, everyone, this brings me down to number 1 on the list. And the number 1 language that I recommend for pretty much anybody to learn in the beginning or as a student is Python. And if you are kind of familiar with some programming experience, or you have some programming experience, this should come to no surprise. And to people who have actually done some research, you probably see that Python is near number 1, but at least between number 1 and number 2 or number 3 on pretty much all lists regarding this topic. And that's because Python is very, very easy to learn, and it's very intuitive compared to some other languages. It's just more easier to understand. When you're reading Python code, it makes more logical sense, and it's easier to kind of pick out certain things, especially for a beginner to learn. The actual, the syntax, or that's kind of what we call how we actually type the code, that is a lot more simpler compared to languages such as Java, JavaScript, and it just makes the entire programming experience, especially as a beginner and learning about programming, a lot easier. In addition, Python is extremely versatile. There are so many things you could do with it. You can, if you're interested in anything regarding data and math, Python is definitely the main language for that. If you're interested in building websites, you can even do that with Python. If you want to build a game, you can do that with Python. In fact, this is an interesting fact, that a lot of the apps that teenagers use, like us, YouTube and Instagram, for example, they are actually built based on Python, or at least the backbone of those programs is Python. So it is just extremely versatile. There are so many resources that you can use to learn, because Python is such a powerful and such a prevalent programming language that there are just so many things you can do with it. It's pretty much, the possibilities are nearly endless. And there are different packages, or kind of think of those as almost extensions. Like, if you're using a browser like Chrome and you wanted to add an ad block to it, that's kind of like an extension. So when I say packages are like extensions for programming languages. And there are just so many different packages that you can add on to Python to add so many different functionalities to the language. Another thing is that Python is often taught in many college courses, as well as even in some high schools. So it's definitely, if you know Python going into those type of classes, then it may help you kind of understand and also perform slightly better in the class, because you'll have a general idea of what they are talking about. In terms of negatives for Python, there really aren't that many. The only one that I can really think of is that you won't learn necessarily that object-oriented that component, because Python's not necessarily an object-oriented programming language, such as Java is. And while this isn't that important, especially if we're learning just as the basics and beginning of programming, eventually you're going to want to learn a little bit more about the object-oriented type of languages. So in that case, I definitely recommend that you can learn Java as well as Python. Those are kind of the two languages I definitely recommend for you to learn. But if you're a complete beginner, Python is a great language to learn. It is so versatile, very easy, and a favorite among many, many developers. And once you learn Python, you'll pretty much be able to do so many things. You will almost never run out of different projects and ideas that you can do. Alright everyone, in this video I kind of talked about the top best programming languages that I believe are the best to learn as a student. Now, if you have any questions, definitely leave them in the comment section below, and I'll try my best to answer all of them. And if you liked the video, feel free to like and subscribe for more content, and as always, thanks for watching.